Okay, dzień dobry. I want some energy. Is anyone going to say dzień dobry back to me? Thank you. Okay, so it's a morning start. Everyone wide awake, I hope. Why don't we all stand up? Everybody on their feet. I'm going to allow you to sit down if you have never heard of the BBC. Sit down if you don't know what the BBC is, you've never heard of it. Okay. Sit down if you've never encountered any BBC content. If you've never read a story, you've never heard anything, you've never seen a BBC show or anything like that. Okay. Sit down if you haven't encountered any BBC content in the last month. Let's be honest, I won't be upset. It's okay. Right, how about the last week? Has anyone encountered BBC content? Sit down if you haven't. Please be honest, I won't be upset. Thank you. Okay, how about in the last 48 hours? So since Monday morning. So we've still got a few. Regular habit, maybe every day. I work for BBC News, maybe BBC News. Right, who's encountered some BBC content this morning? I know one person has, because they tell me they listen to World Service Radio. Is there one man standing? No, we've got two people standing. Okay, how about in the last 10 minutes? Oh, okay, we've got you all down now. Thank you. It's a very useful marketing exercise for me to understand how much people have been involved in the BBC. So I'm going to talk today about connecting stories and personalising news. What you can see here is our fabulous new building. It's in the heart of London. This is the old bit of broadcasting house. It's been around for a long time. The BBC's been around about 80 years. And this is the fabulous new bit. And my office is just about there. And I get a view down Regent Street, all the fabulous old buildings, to Oxford Circus. I'm very lucky. This is probably cost about $1 billion. There's 11 floors, this new thing. So a lot of the news and TV, the big studios are underground. So there's 3 floors underground. So it's a fabulous investment. It's a fabulous place to work, and I know I'm very lucky. This is the newsroom. Now, people have claimed it's certainly the largest newsroom in Europe and possibly the world, although I don't think anyone's gone on record to say that. Let me just go back there. So we've got the big galleries at the back, journalists organised in different teams, and there's one big studio just about here. That's where the main big flagship bulletins go out. And then it goes up several floors. I'll just very quickly give you an outline of how we are organised. And bear in mind our tradition at the BBC. We're probably the only worldwide organisation that covers local, national, and international news and covers it online, on radio, and on TV. So you imagine that matrix. That's a huge linear tradition. So the way we've organised the newsroom is you can see, I just want to make sure I have the right clicker. So on this side, we're focused on UK news, and on that side, we're focused on the world news. But everyone's talking together, and this is what we call a multimedia newsroom. So our planning and our news gathering, we all collaborate together. So when we send off correspondents to cover stories, they're thinking about online, radio, and TV. And then we have different desks devoted to different outputs. Increasingly, though, and bear in mind this newsroom is at the most kind of a year or two old, already we're starting to think that this is outmoded and outdated because it's not multimedia enough and it's not digital enough. Our head of news said that we are all digital journalists now. And that's a challenge for all the BBC News journalists who've been focused on TV, focused on radio, and focused on appointments of you listening, is that what does truly digital content mean? And how do you make the content that works for linear audiences, and we'll all be familiar with this, whether it's newspapers or broadcasting. Linear audiences are starting to decline. Younger audiences in particular are increasingly focused on kind of digital and social and tablets. Everything is mobile first, and certainly we're thinking very hard about what does mobile first mean for us, what does digital first mean for us. So what does it mean for our video? What does it mean for our audio? What does it mean for our kind of whole output? So that's really what I want to talk to you about today, is how we are transforming what we're doing from what was very much targeting niche audiences in a linear way into a real digital first and mobile first offering. And in an organization, a big organization like the BBC, that's not necessarily an easy thing to do. So, our strategy up to now, online, we very much grew up in the early days when newspapers started to experiment with digital, and much of it was about putting a linear experience online. So many online newspapers began by essentially putting a newspaper up online, and you'd see traditional articles, traditional kind of indexes or pages organizing content. This has transformed over the years. Clearly, I mean, our audience now there's more of an audience on mobile and tablet than there is on desktop, for example. We've got interactive kind of programs. We do a lot of interactive graphics. Someone was just telling me in the auditorium earlier how they'd engaged with one of our graphics, which was called 7 billion, which went viral and was very shared. It was about how you... where you are in the kind of population of the world. When we hit 7 billion population, what number were you in that? And it was a clever interactive graphic, very shareable. Have a look at it, search for 7 billion and you'll find it. And it's great fun. But that's the kind of content we've been focused on. Regardless of device, we're not quite fully responsive, but we're heading very quickly that way, using responsive code base. But that's really only the start, because increasingly we need to learn a lesson from linear. We need to niche target different audiences with different content. So what you see on the right there is something we've been doing on Instagram. Very much video that works for an Instagram audience. It's not the kind of thing you necessarily see on our flagship news bulletin at night. But there's a problem with obviously BBC Breaking News, something like 10 million subscribers, followers, very successful at pumping out kind of reliable breaking news. And we've got a lot of different services, social, different platforms, but it's very expensive, of course, to create lots of bespoke content for lots of niche audiences, bespoke audiences. So I think a challenge for us is traditional article appearing on mobile. How do we make the most of each asset we've got? The BBC is not short of quality content. The challenge is getting it in front of the right people who might be interested in that content. And that's a real challenge for us. So, our new strategy, our focus is called Connected Stories. So we want to tell the full story. But how do we do that? We've got all sorts of outputs, all sorts of niche audiences. How do we join up all the different bits of storytelling that we do, all our kind of assets, and make it so that people get relevant experiences? Well, we think one of the answers is to use a form of tagging of all our content. And this is about thinking about how we get audiences to access and follow our stories via things like topics. So you imagine if you're particularly interested in certain topics, then if we can demarcate all our content that we've created across the BBC by those topics, you can get a much richer experience. We also think it's about offering localized and a personalized service. And increasingly, we're focused on how do we aggregate, how do we curate more third-party content, more UGC, user-generated content, that means, so experiences from the audience, etc., comments from the audience, and more data. And we've been very successful in particular with data. We've got a bespoke team that kind of rush up daily infographics, daily graphics. I'm not talking about that today, but I know quite a few of you are interested in that, so I'm very happy to chat to you outside the conference about what we do with graphics, if that's helpful to anyone. So with tagging, we've come up with, in particular, more than just tagging with topics, we've come up with something called storyline. And storyline is really tagging around a story. So it's an instant tag, instant data, that will enable us to gather content, group content together around a story. So if we get a story breaks, like a typhoon or something, then if you can tag all your content that's created with that, then suddenly you get a really rich bit of content, and that's potentially very followable. You'll be aware the focus on streams, on live experiences of short rolling text like Twitter. So we think we can offer something like that on BBC News, and we think the use of automation of tagging will enable us to do that in a more effective and efficient way. So just to kind of explain a little bit about that, what do we do with our bit of content then? Well, if we just tag it traditionally, and many organizations tag content, some of you may, we tag it with individuals, with companies, with kind of key themes, then essentially what you get from that is you are able to do something, but not that dramatic, not that interesting. You can find stories that are tagged with that concept, but it's not really connecting things up. It's not really showing the relationships, the really interesting news stories behind that. So I guess you could categorize it as dumb tagging. It probably makes more of your content than not tagging, but it doesn't necessarily take you very far. So with linked data, what you can do is establish relationships. So, for example, we can say that BMW is a German company and it has a stock market value. So if we tag something with BMW, we know all this information. Each of us individually know a lot of information about BMW. But if we can establish that in the data, if we can link up BMW, we can start to put interesting collections of content together. So it could be about German companies, and maybe it's about their involvement with the UK. It could be about kind of share price fluctuations of German companies. So we can do a lot of interesting information once we link up that data and establish some relationships. And it might be about what politicians have been involved in stories with BMW, for example. So, and pulling the politicians together. So there's a lot of interesting potential information out there, making content more accessible, more interesting for our readers. And of course, if we then allow readers to be able to follow some of that content and access it in a push service, then potentially that's quite valuable, we think, as well, and will prove more engaging than just expecting them to come to a website and peruse what we're suggesting are the top stories of the day. Now, that doesn't mean we still won't be doing things like that, because clearly a lot of people want to know what's the news agenda today, what are the key stories and what are the key things they need to know. But if we can give people more of a relevant kind of experience, then we think that will be very valuable. So part of my role at the BBC has been introducing tagging across our teams. Now, at the moment, I've been focused on our online teams. Some of our teams work in programs, some of our teams work across kind of multimedia, so they're doing radio, TV, and online. But we've got them all focused. We've created a lot of tags, and a lot of these we've kind of named low-hanging fruit. So these are really news-focused tags. We're not trying to tag the ocean. We're not trying to tag everything. We're trying to focus on what's valuable, we think, for the audience and in news context. What do we write news about? So we've created a lot of tags, and it's it's fair to say that we also know that we need to develop tools that will help us with that, because journalists are fairly disciplined, but they don't always get it right. So how can we support journalists in tagging accurately, and how can we roll this out effectively? The ultimate ambition, of course, given our vision of everyone being digital journalists, is to get everyone tagging. So part of my role will be to learn lessons from getting our online journalists tagging and rolling that out across the BBC. And I don't underestimate the challenge of that, but if we can get journalists tagging when they create content out in the field, when they're sending things back to the BBC, and those tags can flow through, potentially that could be really efficient and transforming for the BBC. One of the clear benefits, of course, will be that tagging across enables you to integrate different systems and different technologies. And big organizations tend to have lots of legacy systems, lots of different systems. They're not easy to integrate. It requires a lot of work. When you're asked how long it would take, they usually quote you a year, possibly 2 years to change these things. So the beauty of tagging, you introduce kind of tagging forms across the piece, and you don't need to integrate those systems. So tagging does it for you, and link data does it for you. And our hope is that, given a BBC News focus on big stories and the amount of quality content we create around the main stories of the day, that using storylines as well, particularly, will galvanise us, and we will producing unrivaled and fantastic coverage across the piece. Now, I should also say that the benefit of that is, of course, you can have a stream or an index or a gathering of content around every single one of those tags. So if we get our search engine optimization right, then potentially we become a very valuable in terms of growing our audience. And we've been tasked with doubling the size of our audience from 250 million to 500 million over the next few years. So it's a big ask. We've already got a big audience. So what products have we created so far? Well, this is what we did with the elections that have just gone past. They were European elections, of course, and they're also local elections. And our UK Independence Party did pretty well in those elections. So based on a tag, Vote 2014, so you might call this a story tag. So it was the story of the elections. Content was tagged across the piece. That's kind of video, audio, short text, long text, analysis, tweets, and we created streams out of it. And I apologize, this is a little jerky, and I've never seen it so big on such a massive screen before. But it starts to give you an idea of the kind of content that we can create for our audience. And we're hoping, and certainly what we've seen from audience interactions is this is quite an engaging way of surfacing content. I'm not going to play that again. I don't want you to get seasick. So what else are we thinking about doing? Well, we've got a news app. Some of you may have it. It's had roughly 30 million downloads since we launched it. It's now looking very long in the tooth, even though it felt very modern and new when we launched it. We actually launched it the day the iPad was released, because we had an iPad version at the same time, so it helps me to remember and date when we did it. Already it feels very old-fashioned. So the new app we're working on, here's a sneak preview, the kind of things we're thinking about. You'll see that we're thinking about surfacing tags, which people will be able to follow. They'll be able to create their own personalized news index. So content that you're interested in, you follow. So you support a particular football team. You have shares in a couple of companies. You're particularly interested in certain subjects because of your profession. You can start to create your personalized news. And what is news but things that are relevant to you? So when you check the news, you want to know whether the world is over. You want to know what's happening that you need to know about. So hopefully this again will prove an engaging way of getting relevant content and content that means something to people in front of them. Other organizations have been experimenting with that. Very few so far have experimented with what we're calling storylines. This is all open data. If anyone's interested to know more about storylines or wants to get involved, certainly if you're in the news business, then come and talk to me. because we're keen to collaborate and share. Because if we're all tagging with the same tags, we can start to cross-fertilize and use each other's content. So we think that could be powerful for kind of the audience and a great audience experience. So apps should be coming out sometime this year. My technical teams I work with hate giving me deadlines, and when they do, they're rarely reliable. So watch this space. I guess to summarize, what I wanted to share with you was kind of a journey going a big linear organization with a big legacy, lots of great content. How do we move from that into offering still a brilliant service for individuals that we have? That's our linear tradition. You know, if you live in Derby in England, or you live in Warsaw in Poland, we ought to still be able, in a digital environment, in a digital world, to give you a really relevant news service that means something to you, that's important. We do have the content. The challenge for the BBC is surfacing it in front of you. So the journey we're on, the journey we've taken, is trying to offer that really relevant linear experience in a digital environment, a digital world. I know it's going to be a bumpy journey and it will take some time, but I hope that's been a useful insight for you in sharing what a content provider as big as the BBC is seeking to do and why it's doing it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Russell Smith. Can I have one more question? Actually, when you started your presentation, you showed the newsroom, which seems very modern. You said that it might be the biggest one in Europe. Well, in Europe it is for sure, maybe in the world. But you said that already it's sort of out of date. So what should be changed maybe? What do you think what is the future? It sounds tricky.
I have to be careful what I say here, because I know that there are discussions, there are plans, but when you think about a mobile-first world, a world of live and on, we have a lot of rolling news channels. I think the question must be asked, when there are live events happening, rolling news is really important, but often there aren't really exciting live events going on, really important live events going on. So then should there be more of an on-demand experience as the kind of the world of digital and the world of television starts to merge together? I think there's a really interesting question to be asked about what's the future of rolling news and TV news in a digital connected world. And I think that has some organizational implications. I think also in terms of a journalist working in this newsroom, and particularly if you look at this model where yes, we're integrated and we're all in one room, but we're still focused on different outputs. Increasingly, if we're all digital journalists, can we afford to just focus on one output? How much can journalists be focusing on more than one output, on all outputs, or certainly on digital outputs? And I think that poses a challenge for us, and potentially it suggests we can't stay with this model for too long.
And you also mentioned that you at the BBC want the stories to become more and more personalized. Aren't you afraid of the fact that at the other side of this equation is narrowing people's perspectives, because they would only be interested in their local football team and their local news?
I think that's a fair point. I'm just going to race to the end slide just to help. So we think it's still important to offer the top stories of the day, to offer the main bulletins. This is the news that our editors have said is really important and you need to know about. But I think there's plenty of space to offer, whether in push services, the relevant, the content that the BBC has done that's relevant to you. And I think, certainly in terms of how we're funding the license fee, we need to stay relevant for younger audiences in a digital world. And if they're increasingly finding their content via social and via their mobile phones, then we need to be very active in that space. And if we're not, then that has implications for how relevant we are for the audience. And that's the same globally as well.
Okay. So I guess you're searching for a compromise of some sort.
Well, maybe it'd be better to put it as an even better experience and the best of everything.
Okay, sounds attractive. Thank you very much. Russell Smith, thank you very much.